Good day to my friends at Lakeview Church of the Nazarene. I hope this message finds you well today. The sun is out again. Currently it's Wednesday, and this is day 2 of some great sun that we've been experiencing. So I'm excited for that, driving around with my window down. It's fantastic. And it's January. It's crazy. But I hope it's good. And I'm excited for where we're at in our series on Abide. This idea of being disciples, making disciples, loving our neighbor, pursuing this call as a church, as a faith community, and continuing to dive into and explain in hopes of understanding what we mean when we talk about discipleship. And I hope that you understand that in defining that, it's not that we're trying to figure out what we mean specifically, that it's our own ideas, it's things we come up with or whatever, but it really is looking at a biblical understanding of what it means, what Jesus called us to when he called us out to be disciples. And anchoring all of that in this passage in John 15, the vine and the branches and abiding and the rich imagery that we see. One of the things that I think I've mentioned and kind of briefly spoken to, but when you look at a grapevine, especially one that's old, that's been around for maybe 15 to 20 years. We had one of these in a previous home. It was well over 25 years old. So parts of it, had died, but there was these thick vines and branches. And you really, when you step back and look, you get to a point when vines grow that you can't distinguish really one branch from another. And it's all intertangled and enmeshed together and coming off the vine and supporting one another. And it just grows together and it gives it strength. In one situation, we had parts of the fence and lattice work that it was growing on was rotted out. But it was still up. The base of one of the posts was rotted out. It was literally not supported. But everything was still up. The post was still there. It was all standing. It didn't crumble down. But part of that is because everything that had grown up around it was supporting it. And when I think about Lakeview, when I think about our church and becoming this kind of community that is totally grafted into, adopted into, and just abiding in the presence of Jesus, that I see us over time. Remember, it's the slow work, it's the long scope. Over time, continuing to become more and more connected as a community, supporting one another, living together. And that way of growing together, to me, speaks of intimacy and vulnerability and authenticity and doing life together and accountability and challenging one another and growing together and knowing each other well. And that's a lot of work. And that's risky. But I believe with all that's in me that is the call as Christ followers, that we don't do this alone. It's not a solo journey. It's not a Jesus and me. It's not an individual salvation. Like Jesus does a work for each of us as individuals. There is this process within us, this sanctifying work of Jesus, but it is always and only, in my opinion, in my understanding of Scripture, always and only in the context of community in the kingdom and the family of God. And that's risky and that's hard. And so we've talked about a couple things so far. We've talked about connection with God and community. That's incredibly important when we talk about discipleship. How are we connecting with God? How are we connecting with community? A primary avenue of connecting with God is our Sunday morning worship together. When God breathes us in, it's so important. It's not just checking off the list. It's not so that your pastor feels good about people gathered or butts in the seat. I don't care about the metrics and the measurements. I care about people. I care about hearts. I care about all of us being more like Jesus today than we were yesterday, and the importance of worshiping together. Then last week we talked about transformation. Heard a couple really good stories from both Debbie and Johnny of their experience so far on this emotionally healthy discipleship journey. And again, there's nothing maybe there's some things that are unique that we appreciate as a staff and as a leadership team and the Discipleship International Council. There's things we appreciate about emotionally healthy discipleship. But we believe this is a way of helping us live out this idea of being disciples and making disciples and loving our neighbor. And the tools that this course and the next course in the fall will help us with, will help us be more like Jesus together, will help us look like that grapevine that grows together and supports each other. So this week we're going to talk about production. And I don't like that word and I like that word all at the same time. And I'll probably spend a little bit of time unpacking what it doesn't mean. And when we think about production, there is a sense, especially in an American culture, where it's about success and there's certain measurements that we strive for and looking good from the outside. A lot of the kind of Pharisee, whitewashed tomb, outside of the cup kind of things, the doing. And that's really where it's going to drive deep, is when we talk about it's not about what we're doing for God. But this discipleship journey, abiding in the vine, is all about being with God. And you're going to hear a story from my good friend, Brian Tomlinson, and a new student about to graduate, and what he experienced, the incredible transformation for him as a kid who grew up in the church, of what that was like, and that transition, and what it awakened in him to experience this reality of this call to focus more on being with Jesus, spending time with Jesus, focusing on being a disciple, and not worrying and being consumed with what he's doing for God to look good on the outside. So we'll focus on being over doing, which is a huge, probably central theme of emotionally healthy discipleship. And the tools that come with it to help us in not a restrictive or obligatory way, but an invitation, as we see from Jesus, right? I have called you, this passage that we'll read on Sunday in John 15, starting in verse 9, I called you, I've chosen you, I've appointed you, these invitations from Jesus that then we respond to, not out of obligation, but out of being moved by the heart of Jesus to be more like him. And there's some great language in this text. A lot of times, some translations will say, as I have, so I ask you, or invite you, or just as. And it's this idea of imitation. We see Jesus literally talks about, just as I have done what my Father said, just as I have followed my Father's commands, so I ask you to follow me, abide in me, keep my commands. And there's a sense where Jesus is just living this out. Like, just as I've done this, in being like my Father, in mirroring the image of the Father, just as you see that in me, like all you see in me is me literally doing just as my Father has done. In that same way, when you look to me as Jesus, do just as I have done, knowing that I am doing just as my Father has instructed and called me. So we're going to look at this just as language. We're going to think about and hopefully settle into this recognition that as a church, now we want to be more about being with Jesus, so that our doing, the ministries, the service, the way that we love our neighbor emerges out of our being with Jesus, out of our abiding in the vine, which that is fruit. And that's production. That's producing in a way that I think is all about the metrics of the kingdom and not of this world. So, hang tight. More to come on Sunday. Hope you all have a blessed week. Peace.